placement of things, I don't think. I was playing with the settings last week and I turned on like the red box thing. I don't know if it's like the safe zone or what, but I couldn't get that. There was a red box over the sound screen. I was like, oh no, what have I broken? I was like, maybe there's a setting that's like discolor thing.
Discolor things. I think I just need to order another one of these.
Yeah.
I don't think it's any of the connection because restarting it fixes
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Shelby's phone had a like green vertical bar on it
Yeah.
yesterday, and I thought, well, we're hosed, and then it went away. But we're gonna get it replaced anyway because there's like an extended warranty thing for the Pixel 8 because apparently that happens. So you get one free screen without question. So
Really? I think I probably could have used that for Kenna's Pixel. We just got her a new phone.
yeah, I was like Googling, and I'm like, am I going to like get her a new phone or am I going to do that? And I came across that and I clicked it and it was like, go to You Break I Fix and they'll do it for free.
Oh,
So,
interesting. Well, probably could have saved them not getting her a phone. I mean, they had a deal in like the 9A,
yeah,
which was only took us like $200
yeah,
or whatever. So it's like, yeah, it's whatever.
yeah. At least it's not iPhone level price. You know, it's spending $1,100 and then the screen goes out. You know.
All right, I'll let you get to it.
All
Good
right.
luck.
Yep. Thanks. Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started with or get ready to get started with class this morning. Thanks to everybody for braving the rain that may hold off and not become snow, rain, hail, snow. We might get all the various types of precipitation today. So, but at least I think most of us snuck in before it got too terrible. So we will be in Matthew 26 for the most part today. If you want to go ahead and turn over to Matthew chapter 26. And we've got 3 more weeks, so we'll be covering kind of the final hours that Jesus has, and then the crucifixion next week, and then kind of the aftermath of that in the final class. So still in Jerusalem, haven't changed the setting. Like I said, we'll pick up in Matthew chapter 26. Wanted to quickly discuss before this some of the context that we've discussed in previous classes and what's gone on up to this point. In Matthew chapter 24, there's talk of the destruction of the temple, warnings about future turmoil, the coming of the Son of Man, and then there are some parables in Matthew chapter 25, and we kind of see shift from some of the things that we've been talking about Jesus doing to kind of the preparation for him to go on the cross. That doesn't mean that absolutely everything stops, but we're going to see, kind of a shift in what's going on here. So we'll pick up in Matthew chapter 26. I'm going to read verses 1 through 5 to get us started this morning. Matthew chapter 26, verses 1 through 5. When Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples, You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion. At that time, the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the courtyard of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted together to arrest Jesus covertly and kill him. But they were saying, Not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people. So we see here, we've talked about this. It feels like almost every week that we've been in this class that, we've got the chief priests, the elders, the people who are in charge, even the high priest who are conspiring against Jesus at this point. We've talked a lot about how, various people throughout history, had problems with Jesus and what he was doing, especially those who should have known better, who knew the old law, who, had spent lots of time in the old law. And there's lots of reasons that might have happened. Kind of before we get there, though, we have Jesus, acknowledging what is about to happen in verse 2. He's saying to his disciples, you know, that after 2 days the Passover is coming and the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion. So kind of like we discussed in the last week or two, you know, Jesus, as we know, is aware of what's about to happen. He keeps reminding his disciples and those close to him what's about to happen, you know, because as we discussed, they don't have a complete understanding of everything that's coming. But we've got to probably, from looking at this and how many times it's happened, they're starting to understand that Jesus is going to die, at least from what he's saying. So, you know, that understanding's coming along. We also see here, you know, we've talked about chief priests, elders, scribes before. Scribes aren't mentioned here, but the chief priests and elders are Jewish religious leadership, likely members of the ruling council, the Sanhedrin, different groups we've talked about in the past. We also have Caiaphas, who is somebody we haven't talked about in this class before. He's the high priest, as we see here. He would have overseen temple leadership, presided over Jesus's trial, and the high priesthood was very likely influenced by the Roman political authority. We've kind of talked about, you know, what was going on in the world at the time, and there was a lot of people in leadership positions wanted to keep their power, but they also wanted to keep the peace, right? Because the Romans were really big on we don't want riots, we don't want bad things happening, just pay your taxes, keep the peace, we won't mess with you, you know, don't cause any problems. So we've got kind of all of that going on here. Um, and then if we think about some specific things that Jesus has done, you know, we've kind of hit on these multiple times, but just to summarize, why they would want Jesus dead, you know, we've talked about like in Matthew chapter 23, where Jesus challenges their authority, right? Like he um, calls out things that they're doing wrong, challenges their authority as religious leaders, things like that. Jesus has also gained in popularity, right? He's been going around, he's been teaching, he's been doing miracles, he's been doing lots of things that, you know, he has a following for. You know, some of that following is for the right reasons, some of it's not, but he has a following, he's popular, so, you know, they're going to be challenged by that. There is a facet that we've discussed before that, you know, some of these groups, if they don't believe what he's saying that he's going to do and who he is, that would be blasphemy, right? And so they, you know, in their mind, because they don't understand what's going on, are looking at him as potentially blasphemous. And like I already mentioned, there was a fear of Rome, right? Like this, if Jesus is who he says he is, and he's coming to change the world and do all of these things, there's going to be change, political unrest throughout the system. And so they're also worried about what kind of trouble they'll get in from that. John 11:48 says, if we let him go on like this, all the people will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take over both our place and our nation. And I wanted to read that just because I think that summarizes like how they're feeling pretty well as far as the chief priests, um, you know, that we talk about here. And then we also, by way of reminders, we study through these couple verses. We have talked about the Passover feast in the past. There was, you know, the passing over in Exodus, and for 7 days they were supposed to eat unleavened bread. So we have this feast going on. There would be a lot more people in Jerusalem at this time as well, because people traveled. If you know, I wasn't able to find exact figures on exactly what the population of Jerusalem was, but a lot of the things I looked at said, you know, we might be growing from 50,000 or so people in Jerusalem typically to hundreds of thousands. So we've got quite a crowd. I think rather than the specific numbers, the important point is you got a lot of people, you got a lot going on. This is the kind of situation that like can blow up. And so, you know, they're very worried about that. So we've kind of got all of that going on. And then we see where they plot to take Jesus by trickery and kill him. But they don't want to do it during the feast because they don't want there to be an uproar among the people. And then we'll ultimately see that it still does, because that's what's prophesied. Why do you think that everything they are doing, they are planning by trickery and in darkness, versus by comparison, Jesus being ready to go to the cross and talking about that to his disciples. Why do we have these contrasts, right? Like, if they truly call Jesus being blasphemous, they could do this out in the open. Why is there just such a contrast about their behavior? Yeah.
Is they saw the triumphal entry and they had to see the large number of people that were putting their coats in the streets and all that.
Yeah.
That would make them afraid a little bit.
Right. I think that's a big point, right? Like they're not they have an understanding of the situation that's going on here, right? They know, especially that, like, maybe if they'd been able to take care of Jesus earlier on before he had a following, then maybe they could have done something more publicly, but they need this to, like, they need to orchestrate some things behind the scenes because, of what you mentioned, like there's going to be unrest. Jesus is popular. Why do we think then Jesus is kind of so open with his disciples about what's coming? We kind of talked about this a bit last week, but to contrast to how they're behaving, why is Jesus so open with talking about what's coming?
He knew what was going to happen, and so he wanted them to be ready. Because when this mob comes to get him, and he had to know that was what was going to happen. Yeah. And Judas was going to be there to betray him, and he was one of them. And so it was going to be a traumatic thing for them.
Right. Yeah, I think it's it's impossible for any of us to understand what it's got to be. I mean, just the situation overall, but especially to definitively know what's going to happen. There's a lot of times in life we might have something happen and we're like, oh, we're going to face the consequences of this, even if it's not sinful, right? Like if we lose our job or like something happens like that, we're like, okay, these things are going to happen, but we don't know the definitive outcome. Whereas Jesus does in this instance, and is fairly, from what we can see, I mean, we'll study about how he prays and, struggles like we would as humans, but compared to them is even calm about how he handles this. Yeah.
So if he wouldn't have prepared them in that way, they probably would have fought to the death for him. Yeah. And then they wouldn't be around to relay the message.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting, like the little thing, and we do not have written for us how much Jesus needed to actively do for things to play out like they did. Clearly, he had to do specific things for things to happen like they did, but just all the little things that he does and says so that people have more understanding, I think is just important and something we can take away as well. Yeah.
But he was going to die. They still did not believe that in their hearts.
Yeah.
I mean, even when they came to get him, Peter took his sword out and he was ready to fight. So, it's hard to understand when somebody tells you they're ill and they're going to die from the illness. It's still hard. You don't want to believe it until the day it really happens.
Yeah.
You still hold up that hope that it won't be.
Right. I think you've got both, like exactly what you're saying of like you're holding out hope. Like maybe you've heard the words and you understood them, but like it hasn't like changed how your heart is processing that situation. And I think we've experienced that as well. We might even logically understand something and still deep down in our heart, like that's not, what's happening. Or we might, with emotions, sometimes they change day to day, right? Like we might understand something and even like let it change us that day. And then we kind of flip back too. So I think they've got, his disciples have a lot of that going on. So yeah.
After the fact, he knew this was going to happen.
Yeah.
He truly had that power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it, hopefully solidifies their faith even more when they're able to look back and see some of that. And I think that's another application we can take today when we can look back on our lives and, see times that God was taking care of us. Any other thoughts before we get going? Yeah.
We had a YouTube comment says, to me, the major problem is the populace believe and know he's the Messiah, and Pharisees and the Sanhedrin wanting to protect their power.
Yeah, I think that's like a really good summary of what we're looking at in these first 5 verses is just that like you have a group of people who are in power, they want to hold on to their power. Like I mentioned last week, we see that throughout the world even today, right? And so anything that challenges that, people are going to try to orchestrate and do things to stay in control of their power. And we definitely see that here. And have to watch out for that in our own lives and kind of our own spheres of making sure we don't hold on to our pride or what we have in such a way that it limits what we're supposed to do as Christians. So that's a good point. Any other thoughts before we jump down a couple verses? All right, we are going to jump down to supposed to go to verse 17. I think let's start in verse 14 because I think that's helpful background. So I will read Matthew chapter 26, verse 14 through 25, if you'd like to follow along. Matthew 26, 14 through 25. Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" And they set out for him 30 pieces of silver, and from then on he looked for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. Now, on the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I am keeping the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" The disciples did as Jesus had directed him, and they prepared the Passover. Now, when the evening came, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12, and as they were eating, he said, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." Being deeply grieved, they began to saying to him, each one, "Surely it is not I, Lord." And he answered, "He who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. The Son of Man is going away just as it is written about him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born." And Judas, who was betraying him, said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself." So we have this very sobering passage here of when things continue to unfold from what we talked about here. The first part, verses 14 through 16, I wanted to read just to show that like Judas plotted to do this. Like he wasn't even, from what we read here, it wasn't like, oh, the chief priest came and approached him and was like, he seems like the weak link out of all of this. It seems more like Judas was going to them and like, "What are you going to give me if I choose to betray him? I'm in this position to do this." And we see that happening, and that going on behind the scenes. And then we see that from verse 16 that Judas continues to look for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. And again, that continues with what we talked for the first couple verses, right? Like this, Judas also realizes he's got to be careful about how he does this, right? If he does it in front of the wrong crowd of people or at the wrong time of day, whatever the case might be, he could find harm himself. So he's looking for this opportunity to betray him. And someone who is as close to Jesus as Judas is, spending all this time with him, would have probably a pretty good sense of when to do that. So we have that background. And then we have, the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" So we're going to have this Passover meal. And I think verse 18 was interesting to me, just with how we studied what we did last about the colt. And we see kind of another thing that, at least in my brain, triggered something where it says, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I'm keeping the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So we have another instance where it seems like we don't have the full picture here, because the disciples are going to go to someone who, for what we have that we read here, wouldn't necessarily know why they're coming, and they're going to be able to say a phrase to this person, and then the disciples and Jesus are going to be able to eat here. And I think this is just interesting because of what we just studied about the cult and how the disciples went and said, they had the exchange that Jesus said they exact needed to have, and then they were given what they needed. And it's interesting to me that happened here too. And I think this goes to kind of, in my head at least, what Stuart was alluding to about like how certain things play out and things like we don't know if this was just like Jesus knew what was in their hearts and knew what to say to them, or if he had already talked to them or like had some conversation through other people. That's not directly the important part, but I do think that there are specific reasons that a lot of these things happen to lead up to the cross, and that, Jesus and God, make sure things unfold like they're supposed to, so that, um, you know, in this instance, that we can ultimately have the perfect sacrifice and everything that was prophesied. But that goes on to, uh, happen throughout the Old and the New Testament, where, you know, God is making things happen, or in this case, Jesus is making things happen. So anyway, that stuck out to me since we just studied about the colt. I thought that was an interesting thing. Yeah.
A week or so ago, and this one now, I was thinking maybe on my way home, or I don't know, maybe in the middle of the night. Remember when Paul showed up in Corinth and there was some persecution in Acts chapter 18?
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus appeared to Paul that night, and it's some of the rare read words of Jesus in the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent, for I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city."
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, Paul didn't know who those people were.
Yeah.
But God knew that there were people in Corinth who were willing to help Paul.
Yeah.
And he told him about it to comfort him.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to tie all that together, that it even continues after what we'll study in the next couple of weeks. So anyway, that struck me differently than it had before, so I thought I'd mention it. And then we see that the disciples did as Jesus had directed them and prepared for the Passover. So we have this preparation going on for the meal that they're going to eat together. Typically, this meal took place after sunset. That's when the Passover meal was supposed to begin. We see that they're reclining at the table, which is typically how they ate at this time, where they would be on one arm eating. And so we've got all that going on. And then kind of, we've got this scene where from there, things aren't necessarily going good, but they're going to eat together, and it's unlikely that the disciples are expecting what is about to happen, right? Like, they're sitting down to eat. They're probably like, we can relax a bit. And then, this sobering situation happens that I think would shake all of us, right? If it happened to us, where Jesus says, "Truly I say to you that one of you will betray me." So if we think for a second, we're just sitting around this table, even if it's not with Jesus, just with our loved ones or anything, and somebody says something like that, how much it would like strike and surprise us. And then we have, this happening with Jesus and these 12 disciples who have been, or these disciples who've been with him. And so, we've got that stage set, and as we see here, they're each questioning, like, is it going to be me? They're thinking like, I wouldn't do that. And so anytime that you have been in an instance, I can remember times, not so much directly like this at work, but like we'd be at like football practice or something, and some team member would have pranked somebody, right? Or like done something they shouldn't have. And the coach would be like, okay, if nobody comes forward, everybody's going to run for this or something like that. And you're all like looking around like, I'm not the one who did this, but you also don't know who's the one who did it. And that was the closest I could associate to like something in my life like this. And this is even way more, important than that. And you're kind of like, you start to doubt yourself even in the moment. You're like, I don't think I did anything like that, but like in all of that's going on, and like who's going to fess up and all that. So I'm sure we've all experienced similar situations in our lives. And like, so all of these disciples are definitely going through that. And I think something that's interesting, that I also noticed as I was studying through that, if we look at verse 22, each one responds and says, "Surely it is not I, Lord." But if we look at verse 25, we see, and Judas, who was the one betraying him, said, "Surely it is not I, Rabbi." And I just thought that was interesting how Judas referred to Jesus as Rabbi, whereas the rest referred to him as Lord. We don't have to go super deep on that, but it's like probably how Judas is looking at Jesus versus the rest of them, right? Like, how does he revere and respect him versus the other ones? So I thought that was an interesting point as I was studying through this, just the difference in the call out there. But then we see Jesus answering kind of from the first round of this. He who dipped his hand with me in the bowl is the one who will betray me. And, this kind of relates the intimate setting that's going on here. You know, when I looked up what this likely means, you know, it's like if we go out to eat and go to a Mexican restaurant, we're sharing salsa or something like that. Like we would be sitting closer together to share some of those things, right? Like we're not talking about a setting where they're not like close together or they're sitting across from each other at a restaurant. Like this is an intimate setting, you know, and so I think that has been portrayed here, and it makes it just even more hurtful that like Jesus is going to be portrayed here because of how close all of these men and this group was. So I think we've got, you know, all of that going on, and then, you know, they're all going to be worrying about this, and then Jesus says that the Son of Man is going away just as it was written about him, but woe to the man whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. And I think, you know, we understand what Jesus is getting at here. Like, this is going to be such a strong betrayal. You know, like ultimately this needed to happen to follow God's plan, but that doesn't mean that Judas was off the hook for his behavior and what he was doing here, right? It wasn't like Judas could say, oh, I know of the prophecies and I know of what's supposed to happen. I was just helping further God's plan, right? Like he is still in the wrong with what he's doing here. So I think we see that here as well. And then kind of what I already mentioned about Judas's response, at least, you know, being different in one word than what we see from the other ones. So we've got all that conflict going on here. And I guess one of the questions I had for you all that I kind of hit on is like, how do we end up in a situation where, you know, we've got Judas who ultimately is carrying out what happens to cause Jesus to go to the cross? So it's part of the plan of salvation that we have, but he's committing sin to do it. Like, how do we, I know that's a deep question, but how do we reconcile that? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, he did this, and like Peter did too, he had the choice of repenting if it was so, you know, but he chose not to. So yeah. It's really our choices that put us where we are.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point too, of like, even not just in this moment him making the wrong decision, but what does he do, you know, based on that in the future? And like, because we know as Christians today, we're all going to mess up and make mistakes. And we see verses that even call out like how some of our mistakes are just like mocking against Jesus and what he did. But we have that opportunity to recognize that and repent and turn away from that. So I think that's important. Any other thoughts on that or anything else from these verses? Yeah.
It says we must also remember that Judas was stealing from the disciples like during that whole time.
Yeah.
So there's a whole undercover thing going on.
Right. His heart was not in the right place for a long time. And I think that highlights, you know, it doesn't directly say that if he hadn't been doing that, then this wouldn't have happened. But a lot of times I think that's how sin works in our lives, right? Like we do something that might seem smaller and become more and more calloused in our conscience. And we're like, well, this isn't really hurting anybody that much. Or like, if I'm taking from the treasury here, Jesus can miraculously make as much as he wants. How much does this hurt for somebody to do, you know, take out of the treasury? So I think that's a really good point, you know, that we can apply to our lives today, of why we don't want to let some things we might consider be like smaller sins not be addressed over time, because that just calluses us and makes it easier for us to do the big things. All sin is sin and transgression of the law, but the more callous we become, you know, the easier it is for us to fall into temptation. So yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's interesting that the other disciples didn't pound on Judas.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. And they're all like wondering too, like, you know, maybe Judas was the only one, or maybe a couple of them had, or something like that. And like that, adding to this scene that we're seeing of like, you know, what's going on here, and then being confused, and then like Judas knows exactly what's going on here, and he's probably a little panicked. I mean, it's like so interesting because, you know, Judas would have had to have seen the cases where Jesus could read people's hearts and minds, and that he like must just not have believed that, or just literally did not care, I guess, are the only two ways I can process that, because if he thought Jesus could actually do that, then he's going to know Jesus knows what he's about to do. So I don't know what way he was going. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think we, you know, there's another good lesson for us today. Like, we all have opportunities to turn back. Like, no matter how bad it gets or how far we've gone, even if we're like on the precipice of doing something, even if it's going to get us in trouble that we got that far, we can still stop. But most times, like you're saying, once, you know, our mind's been made up.
He knew what he was going to do, but I think he makes that statement to kind of cover himself.
Yeah.
So that they don't think he's the one that's going to do it.
Yeah.
And he would look bad on their side at that point, or maybe try to stop him.
Right. Like, I think if the other disciples do, you know, at least Peter's probably going to jump up and fight him or something like that. So, yeah. So I think he's got to be careful about that too. And it's like this back and forth. And like, you know, maybe that's a good point of like, Jesus also knows what needs to happen. And like, he's not going to be able to change Judas's mind, you know, because when Jesus knows people's hearts and stuff, he doesn't often waste time saying words that aren't going to like change, you know, people's outcomes either. And so, yeah.
Trial to me is, did he truly understand what they were going to do to Jesus? I mean, you know, he betrayed them and maybe thought, you know, they're going to scourge him, they're going to run him out, they're going to make him, you know, pay for this and that and the other. When it comes right down to where they did, and then he goes back and throws the money out and says, I don't want this.
Yeah.
You know, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe
I mean,
not,
when
you
we
know.
get, I feel like, you know, the point we can take away from that, even though, is that it's easy for us in the moment to rationalize things, right? Like, we're like, I'm doing this maybe for the reason you said, of like, it won't end up that bad for him, or like any number of ways that Judas could have rationalized it. Like I said earlier, maybe he's like, in some weird sense, like, I'm helping fulfill God's plan, or however, you know, we don't know his exact internal thoughts. But I think we've all also experienced that, where we're caught up in something in our lives and we rationalize it for any number of reasons, and like let ourselves do that. And I think this can be a lesson for us too, of like we just mentioned, if it had been more public, you know, this would have been a weird situation. But if the other disciples had known, there might have been some confrontation, but that might have also led to some change in Judas, right? And so like, we, you know, that can be another lesson for us. Yeah.
Also, it's like when we're around people and they're starting to joke and, you know, this kind of stuff, and then they start with the raunchy jokes and things like that. It's up to us to either stay or go away, you know, because it can influence us. And sometimes we think, oh, it's not going to hurt us, but that's not really true. It can hurt us in one way, you know, not only in them knowing that maybe we were Christians, but it also gets into our minds, you know, and it's hard to put things like that out of our minds sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have your hand up?
I just like how verse 25 just kind of ends it, you know. He says, surely it's not I, and he doesn't call him Lord, he calls him Rabbi, and pointed that out. But Jesus' answer, that your yes is yes, and he just point blank says, yes, it is you. And that's the way it's written in my version. I don't know what anybody else has, but that pretty much says it right there.
Yeah.
Yes, it is you.
The
I mean,
way-
after all the other ones said the same thing, when it came to him, he's like, yes, it is you.
And like
No
the
doubt.
scene that unfold, you know, we don't even, because like in Matthew, at least, like the next verse that we have after that is talking something we read about the Lord's Supper, right? Like we'll read that to prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper, of Jesus taking some bread and blessing it and all of that. And so like, it's always interesting what we have, you know, as direct context of like what's gone on, you know, that we see here and not. So any other thoughts before we move on to the last section? Yeah.
It just seemed like that would have been enough for him to be like, maybe I shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
It just feels like he must have been so good.
Right, because a lot of times for us, it's like once we're, like we might continue in sin or do something we're not supposed to because we don't get caught. And we're like, okay, this isn't that big of a deal. I haven't got caught for it. It's not hurting anybody. But most of the time when you have like been caught and found out and confronted, you at least act sad in front of the people. Like, right? Like you're like, oh my goodness, I should have done that. Maybe you don't actually care in your heart, but usually there's some outward showing of that, or you change your plan or whatever. But like we don't see any indication of that here. Yes.
Slippery slope. Once it's no different than like if you cheat on your spouse. The first time it's probably hard, but it gets easier and easier and easier. Same thing with like if I'm the treasurer here. If I was to take something from the treasury, the first time I would never do that, but because I would think it would be instant death to me.
Yeah.
Death not only in this life, but future life.
Yeah.
But it would be easier once you did it once. And you see all these treasurers throughout nonprofits, different things, and also regular companies who have done this.
Yeah.
And it takes years for them to get caught a lot of times. And they just slowly, they can be hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars before they're finally caught because they're in a position where they can hide it for a while.
And like a lot of times that starts as like, oh, I needed
So
to
it's
grab
like-
$5 cash out of the register and like do this. And then it builds up and you're like, well, I work pretty hard here. Like I deserve more, or like, and you rationalize it like we were talking about. So I definitely think
Bottom line is if we have the faith that we're supposed to have, it should never even be consideration.
Yeah.
And so your point before, he must not have had strong enough faith to even start stealing from the funds.
And then just like, and I think that's such an important reminder and sobering thought for us today of like, we have to regularly reflect on what we're doing and like make sure that we recognize, because like, it wasn't like Judas didn't know that it was wrong to steal and that he didn't know what he was about to do was wrong. And I think we like see that too. Like it's very rare, especially once we're adults, that we're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that was a sin, this thing that I'm caught up in. It's more of the rationalizing. And so like if when we are feeling stronger and have that stronger faith, we can build in that reflection and that prayer time and that time when we are looking at ourselves and challenging ourselves, I think that helps us at least recognize when we need to reach out for help from others, or we need to like be more focused, because sometimes it does just get away from us, right? And that isn't an excuse for us not to try to change, but that's why the church is set up the way it is because we're supposed to help each other's brothers and sisters in Christ, right? We are not put off on an island by ourselves because, if I'm not around the world at all, I'll never be influenced by it. We are a community here, and we are supposed to like help each other and keep each other accountable. At least, that's my take on a lot of how we have the New Testament telling us to have the church set up in the way that we are, is to foster that and us keeping each other accountable as Christians. So good points. Yeah.
It says the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. I mean, and people that love money will go to extremes.
Yeah.
To get more.
Right. I feel like money's the big one, power, like we've been talking about. Usually those two go hand in hand, I want more of whatever it is, and that just leads us to be so distracted, from what we're supposed to be doing. Cool. Let's keep going to I'm going to read verses 36 through 46, and that's what we'll try to get through today. Matthew chapter 26, verses 36 through 46. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and told his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." And he took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee with him and began to be grieved and distressed. Then he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch with me." And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." And he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So you men could not keep watch for me for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying so that you do not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, "My Father, if this cup cannot pass away unless I drink from it, your will be done. Again, he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And he left them again and went away and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Behold, the one who is betraying me is near. So we see this scene after all the other things that we've talked about, and there's a lot going on here. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to hit a couple of the high points. But Jesus asks his disciples to sit where they were while he goes and prays, and he takes Peter and the two sons of Zebedee with him. And we can see here from all this that we're seeing that Jesus is distressed, right? It says, he even says, my soul is deeply grieved. He prays multiple times, like essentially, I don't want to do this, but I get that I have to do it, so I'm going to do it because it's God's will, right? And like I think that is great for us to see Jesus, not necessarily being vulnerable, being open about this like this, because he's suffering like we do, right? Like that's why he came. And there are going to be times where we are, as Christians, supposed to do something and we really don't want to, but we do it because it's what God wants us to do or what he's told us in his word. And so I think this is a good example of that. Like Jesus knew from years and years ago what was going to happen, how this was going to unfold, everything we've talked about. As weird as it sounds, like he's even had time to like come to terms with this because he's known what's going to happen, but he still feels like this. And I think that is hopefully a comfort for us, maybe distressing knowing that we are going to face hard times like this as Christians, but knowing that like even Jesus was thinking through this and distressed about it. So I think that's the first thing that I wanted to point out. And then kind of the other part of this that we see here is the three who went with him, like we can probably assume that he was going through a stressful time. So he wanted some level of like camaraderie and support as he was going through this, because this was a very hard time for him. And we see here just the weakness that we as humans have in ourselves of he's praying and they fall asleep. And so this happens once, and we are all probably sitting here thinking, man, if this happened to me once to Jesus, you better bet, like, I would not turn around and fall asleep again. But I think we've all experienced this when you're really tired and like, they've had a stressful time, right? Like there's been a lot going on in each of their lives as they prepare for this, and and I think this goes to what we've discussed earlier too. It's likely they still didn't completely understand everything that was going to happen, right? Like if they knew like Jesus is about to die for sure and all of this is going to unfold, maybe they would have been more with it and more alert to be able to be like, we're going to stay awake and we're going to fight through this sleepiness. But like we've discussed, there's probably a lot of things going on in their mind. And then we see in verse 41 a quote that a lot of us know and have probably heard in different things, but it says, keep watching and praying so that you do not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And I think we face that a lot in our lives, where we may really want to do something, but like our fleshly bodies hold us back, and we have to fight against that and have that spiritual discipline in a lot of cases to be able to do that. And then we see this happen a second time for them, where Jesus goes to pray, and again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And then he gets frustrated with them for this, and kind of reiterates that the hour is at hand and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners, and then says, get up, let's go. Behold, the one who is betraying me is near. And so I think, we see, like I mentioned, just the Jesus kind of going through this and processing this just like we would, struggle with this same situation if we knew it was coming. And then we also see kind of the other side of like when he asks these three guys to be supportive of him, they're not able to because they've got their own stuff going on. Maybe they don't realize what all is about to unfold in entirety. So they fall asleep, which would be like also super embarrassing, if you're having this happen right in the face of Jesus with everything that he's going through. So I think those are some important things that we take away from this. And then one more thing I wanted to mention before I ask for your all's thoughts was just if we compare and contrast like Jesus, who is also tired at this point, who is also likely emotionally exhausted, stays alert and vigilant because he's praying, because he's doing something, because he's spiritually alert about what's going on. That's going to help him stay awake in this moment. We're talking about being physically awake here, but we see the disciples who are not actively praying, who are not doing these things, being sleeping, kind of not being able to overpower their physical bodies with their spirit, what their spirit knows they need to do. And I think that's another application that we can take for ourselves, right? It's going to be very easy for us to fall asleep spiritually and let that weakness creep in if we're not doing the things we're supposed to, praying and being active and things like that. And I know that's not the direct application of this passage, but it was something that came to my mind as we read through this. So blitz through a lot there. Any thoughts on any of that, or questions or things to bring up from those 10 verses in the last minute or two that we have?
I just think of how quickly we fail him.
Yeah.
And he gives us the direct,
Yeah.
stay awake.
Right.
Pray, and we so quickly, fall asleep spiritually and in which ways.
Right, like they're, we can sit here and judge all we want to looking back on them, but we do the exact same thing where we'll turn around in the span of minutes and do the something that we know we're not supposed to. So I think that's something that we should keep in mind and hopefully motivates us to stay more alert and with it. Thought I saw another hand. Yeah.
Probably, Jesus was their comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're with him, so they're, even though they don't see, he's their strength, and so they don't see him be weak.
Yep.
And no matter how plain he said it to them, it didn't, of course, a lot of things he said to them didn't soak in anyway. They just had a hard time until it was after the facts, understanding what he told them.
Yeah, and I think that's, something for us to keep in mind too, of like, I feel like as we grow up through childhood, it's very easy to like look up to our parents and look up to people older than us that like, to the point you were making of like, they provide me comfort, or they provide me like shelter, or different things. And it doesn't just have to be parents. And then I think as you get older and older in adulthood, you realize that the age component can matter, but doesn't always matter, because Jesus was around the same age as these guys, but like you mentioned, he was still their comfort and who they looked to. And I think like on both ends, like that is comforting for us with it being Jesus in that, but also like remembering that just because we look up to somebody and they provide and they do all of that, like they still get tired, they still get worn out, they still are going through things in their own lives. And I think that's especially something we keep in mind as we like appoint elders even today, right? Is that like just because people accept certain positions or certain responsibilities doesn't mean that they just stop feeling like what they were before and they don't feel any of the weight of the world or anything like that. So I think that's something for us to keep in mind too, that we don't just like take it easy because other people are handling that, for us in our minds. So I think those are all good points. Any last thoughts before we close? All right. If not, thanks for another good class.